I'm Sarah Mitchell, 34, and 3 days ago, I stood outside St. Mary's Cathedral watching my own father's funeral through rain-streaked windows, banned by my own family. My stepmother Margaret had made it crystal clear I wasn't welcome. "Your father's real family will be saying goodbye," she'd sneered over the phone. For 15 years, I'd been treated like the unwanted reminder of my father's first marriage, always excluded, always dismissed. My half-brother David got the business opportunities. My half-sister Emma got the college fund. And I got nothing but cold shoulders at family gatherings. But today, sitting in lawyer Thompson's mahogany-paneled office, everything changed. The will reading that Margaret insisted I attend for legal purposes just revealed the most shocking twist of my life. While they expected to inherit everything, my father had quietly left me his entire $12 million estate. The construction company, the properties, everything. Like and subscribe if you've ever been the black sheep who got the last laugh. I can still remember the exact moment my life changed forever. I was 14, sitting in the hospital waiting room, clutching a faded photo album that contained the last pictures of my mother and me together. The cancer had taken her so quickly, just 6 months from diagnosis to that terrible October morning when the machines finally went silent. Dad had been devastated, or at least I thought he was. He'd held my hand at the funeral, his calloused construction worker's fingers trembling against mine as we watched them lower Mom's casket into the ground. "It's just you and me now, sweetheart," he'd whispered, his voice breaking. "We'll take care of each other." But grief, I learned, makes people do strange things. Within 3 months, Dad was dating Margaret Chen, a real estate agent who'd sold him his first commercial property. She was everything my mother wasn't: polished, ambitious, calculating. Where Mom had been warm and nurturing, Margaret was cold and efficient. Where Mom had encouraged my art and writing, Margaret saw only impracticality. "Girls need to be realistic about their futures," she'd say, flipping through my sketches with barely concealed disdain. "Art doesn't pay bills." The wedding happened exactly 11 months after Mom's funeral. I wasn't even consulted about the date. I found out when Margaret started planning the reception in our backyard, the same spot where Mom's memorial service had been held. When I protested, Dad just looked tired and defeated. "Margaret makes me happy, Sarah. Can't you just be glad for me?" But happiness, I quickly learned, came with conditions. Margaret brought her own children into our home. David, who was 3 years older than me and already showing signs of the entitled arrogance that would define him, and Emma, just 2 years my senior, but light years ahead in manipulation skills. The photo album that had once sat proudly on our mantelpiece, filled with pictures of Mom, Dad, and me at various family gatherings, vacations, and milestones, gradually began to thin out. First, the most recent photos of just Mom and me disappeared. Then the wedding pictures. Then anything that showed our life before Margaret. "We need to make room for new memories," Margaret explained when I found the album hidden in a storage box in the basement. "It's not healthy to live in the past." By my 15th birthday, it was as if my mother had never existed in that house. Margaret had redecorated everything, replacing Mom's warm, eclectic style with sterile, modern furniture and neutral colors. My mother's garden was torn up and replaced with low-maintenance landscaping. Even the kitchen, where Mom had taught me to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies, was gutted and redesigned. But the most painful change was in Dad himself. The man who had once attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every small milestone in my life, gradually became a stranger. Margaret's children needed his attention now. David with his football games and college applications, Emma with her dance recitals and social dramas. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by my junior year of high school, the favoritism had become impossible to ignore. While David received a brand new truck for his 16th birthday, "Every boy needs reliable transportation," Margaret had declared. I was told the family budget was too tight for driving lessons. When Emma wanted to join the expensive dance academy across town, Dad somehow found the money. When I asked for art supplies for my AP studio class, I was handed a $20 bill and told to make it work. I learned to make everything work. While my classmates complained about their part-time jobs, I was grateful for mine. I started working at Henderson's art supply downtown, partly because I needed the money, but mostly because Mrs. Henderson reminded me of my mother, kind, encouraging, and genuinely interested in my artistic development. "You have real talent. Sarah," she'd say, watching me organize the oil paints with the same care other teenagers reserved for their social media profiles. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." What I didn't know then was that Mrs. Henderson had worked as my father's secretary for nearly 20 years, back when Mitchell Construction was just a two-man operation run out of a rented garage. She'd known my mother, had watched their courtship, had even helped plan their wedding. But Margaret had made it clear that Dad's old life connections weren't welcome in their new family dynamic. The missed milestones became a pattern I learned not to expect anything different from. When I graduated with honors from high school, earning a partial scholarship to the state university, Dad was at David's baseball tournament 3 hours away. Margaret attended the ceremony alone, sitting in the back row and leaving immediately after my name was called. "Your father wanted to be here," she said later, not meeting my eyes. "But David's team made it to regionals. You understand?" I did. Understand. I understood that I would always come second, third, or last. I understood that my achievements, no matter how significant, would never warrant the same celebration as David's mediocre athletic performances or Emma's social media. Follower count at college became my escape hatch. With my partial scholarship, a student loan, and money saved from 3 years of part-time work, I enrolled in the journalism program and threw myself into campus life with desperate enthusiasm. For the first time in years, I was around people who didn't know my family history, who judged me on my own merits rather than my position in the household hierarchy. I called home less and less frequently. When I did, the conversations were stilted and brief. Dad would ask generic questions about my classes. Margaret would make passive-aggressive comments about my chosen major, and David and Emma would barely acknowledge my existence. The few times I visited during breaks, I felt like a stranger in what had once been my childhood home. "You're becoming quite the intellectual," Margaret would say, making it sound like an insult. "I hope you're not getting too big for your britches." The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had pushed me toward practical career choices now seemed threatened by my academic success. When I made Dean's List my sophomore year, I called to share the news. Dad's response was lukewarm congratulations, followed by 20 minutes of bragging about David's new girlfriend and Emma's internship at Margaret's real estate firm. That's when I stopped calling altogether. I finished college in 3.5 years, graduating summa cum laude with a double major in journalism and business. I had job offers from 3 different newspapers and had already started freelancing for several online publications. I was building something that was entirely mine, separate from the family that had made it clear I didn't quite belong. The graduation ceremony came and went, without any family in attendance. I told myself I didn't care, that I'd grown beyond needing their validation. But when I saw other graduates hugging their parents, posing for photos, celebrating achievements that were recognized and celebrated, I felt that familiar ache of being on the outside looking in. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was in my apartment in Chicago, rushing to get ready for a morning interview with the mayor about the city's new housing initiative. The phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, from my hometown that I hadn't seen in months. "Sarah, this is Dr. Martinez from Mercy General Hospital." The voice was professional, but gentle. "I'm calling about your father, Robert Mitchell. I'm very sorry to tell you that he passed away early this morning." The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering against the kitchen floor. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the words sank in. Dad was gone, just like that. No warning. No chance to say goodbye. No opportunity to bridge the chasm that had grown between us over the years. "What happened?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Heart attack. He was brought in around midnight, but we couldn't save him. I'm very sorry for your loss." I spent the next hour in a daze, canceling my interview, calling my editor to explain the situation, booking a flight home. It wasn't until I was sitting in the airport, staring at my phone, that I realized I should probably call the family. Margaret answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "Oh, Sarah." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I suppose someone had to call you eventually." The coldness in her tone shocked me back to full awareness. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know how much Dad meant to you. Yes, well, we're all devastated, of course. The children are taking it very hard. She paused, and I could hear voices in the background. David and Emma, I assumed, making arrangements. The funeral is Thursday at St. Mary's, 2 o'clock. I'll lie. Be there, I said quickly. Do you need help with anything? I can… That won't be necessary. Her interruption was sharp, final. We have everything handled. This is a time for family, Sarah. Real family. The line went dead before I could respond. I flew home anyway, of course. What else could I do? Despite everything, despite the years of coldness and exclusion, Robert Mitchell had been my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who bandaged my scraped knees, who once promised we'd take care of each other. I checked into a hotel rather than assuming I could stay at the family house. It was a good decision, as it turned out. When I called Margaret Wednesday evening to ask about the funeral arrangements, her response was swift and brutal. I've been thinking about this, Sarah, and I don't think it's appropriate for you to attend. I'm… Sorry, what? The service is for people who actually cared about Robert. People who were part of his life. You made your choice years ago when you cut us out of your life. You can't just show up now and play the grieving daughter. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. Margaret, he was my father. He was your father by blood only. David and Emma were his real children, the ones who actually spent time with him, who cared about him. Your presence would be disruptive and inappropriate. You can't stop me from attending my own father's funeral, can't I? Her voice took on a cruel edge. This is a private family service, Sarah. The church knows who's expected. Security has been notified. If you try to force your way in, you'll only cause a scene and embarrass yourself. I hung up and immediately called the church, but the secretary confirmed what Margaret had implied. The service was limited to immediate family and close friends, and my name wasn't on the list. Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. I drove to St. Mary's anyway, parking across the street from the church where I'd been baptized, where I'd attended Sunday school, where my mother's funeral had been held 15 years earlier. I sat in my rental car, rain streaking down the windshield, watching as people began to arrive. I recognized some of Dad's work crew, neighbors from the old days, family friends I hadn't seen in years. They all walked past the church entrance without any trouble, greeted by Margaret and my half-siblings, who stood near the doors like some sort of receiving line. At exactly 2 p.m., I got out of my car and walked toward the church. The rain had intensified, soaking through my black dress within seconds. I made it to the sidewalk before a security guard approached me. "Excuse me, miss, are you on the family list? I'm Sarah Mitchell. Robert Mitchell was my father." The guard checked his clipboard, then shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, but you're not authorized to enter. Family's orders." So I stood there in the rain, watching through the stained glass windows as they said goodbye to my father without me. I could see the outline of the casket, surrounded by flowers. I could hear the organ music, muffled by the thick stone walls, but I couldn't be part of it. That's when I felt a gentle touch on my arm. I turned to see Mrs. Henderson from the art supply store, holding an umbrella over both of us. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry." Her eyes were red with crying. "This is wrong. Your father would be horrified." "Did you know him well?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect she knew more than she'd ever let on. She smiled sadly. "Oh, child, I was his secretary for 23 years. I knew him better than anyone, and I know he never stopped loving you or regretting how things turned out." She pressed something into my hand, a funeral program that someone had given her. "He talked about you all the time, you know. He was so proud of your success, your independence. He didn't know how to bridge the gap that had grown between you." As the service ended and people began filing out, Mrs. Henderson squeezed my arm. "There's something you should know, Sarah. Something your father made me promise to tell you if anything ever happened to him." Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in my mind for the next 3 days as I wandered around my hometown like a ghost. I'd extended my hotel stay, unable to bring myself to leave just yet, even though there seemed to be nothing keeping me here. The family had made it clear I wasn't welcome at any of the post-funeral gatherings. I was truly alone with my grief. I spent Friday morning at my mother's grave, something I hadn't done in years. The headstone looked smaller than I remembered, weathered by 15 years of seasons. I'd brought fresh flowers, white roses, her favorites, and found myself talking to her as if she could hear me. I don't know what to do, Mom, I whispered, kneeling on the damp grass. He's gone. And I never got to make things right with him. I never got to tell him I forgave him, or that I understood why he chose them over me. I never got to say goodbye. The call came Saturday morning while I was packing my suitcase, finally ready to return to Chicago and try to piece my life back together. The hotel room phone rang, an unusual occurrence in the age of cell phones. Miss Mitchell? This is James Thompson from Thompson and Associates. I'm your father's attorney. I sat down heavily on the bed. Oh, hello, Mr. Thompson. I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Mitchell. Your father was a good man and a valued client. His voice was warm, professional. I'm calling because I need to schedule a reading of your father's will. Would Monday at 2 p.m. work for you? Monday? I was confused. But, shouldn't the family handle that? I'm not sure I need to be there. There was a pause on the other end. Miss Mitchell, you are family, and yes, your presence is absolutely required. The will specifically names you as a beneficiary. My heart started racing. A beneficiary? After years of being excluded from everything, Dad had remembered me in his will? Maybe it was just something small, a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, or perhaps a few $1,000s. But still, it meant he had thought of me. Of course, I said quickly. Monday at 2 p.m. Will the others be there too? Yes, Mrs. Margaret Mitchell and her children have been notified. They seemed surprised that you were being included. There was something in his tone that suggested he'd witnessed Margaret's reaction firsthand. The reading will take place at my office downtown, 412 Main Street, Suite 300. After I hung up, I called my editor and arranged to work remotely for another week. Something told me this was going to be more complicated than a simple will reading. Sunday dragged by slowly. I found myself driving past Dad's house, the house where I'd grown up, where my mother had planted her rose garden, where I'd taken my first steps and lost my first tooth. Margaret's car was in the driveway, along with David's truck and Emma's small sedan, the perfect little family, grieving together behind closed doors. I wondered what they thought about my inclusion in the will reading. Were they annoyed? Worried? Did they think I might try to claim some part of Dad's legacy? The truth was, I didn't want anything from them. I'd built my own life, my own career. I was doing well as a freelance journalist, making enough to live comfortably in Chicago. Whatever small token Dad had left me, I'd treasure it, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented. Proof that somewhere, beneath all the years of distance and disappointment, he had still considered me his daughter. Monday morning, I put on my best professional outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought for important interviews, and drove downtown to Thompson and Associates. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of one of the town's few high-rise buildings, a testament to their success in a small city where most businesses operated out of strip malls and converted houses. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt endless. My palms were sweating, and I kept rehearsing what I'd say to Margaret and the others. I wanted to be gracious, dignified. I wouldn't give them any reason to accuse me of being dramatic or inappropriate. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, directed me to a conference room at the end of a long hallway. Through the glass doors, I could see Margaret, David, and Emma already seated at a polished mahogany table. They looked up as I approached, their expressions ranging from Margaret's obvious irritation to Emma's nervous fidgeting. "Sarah," Margaret said coolly as I entered. "How unexpected to see you here." "Mrs. Thompson called me," I replied, taking a seat across from them. "I was told my presence was required." David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. At 32, he'd developed the soft appearance of someone who'd never had to work too hard for anything. "This is probably just some legal formality. Dad probably left you his old toolbox or something." Emma, now 27 and still as beautiful as she'd been in high school, offered a weak smile. "I'm sure it's nothing major, Sarah. Dad wasn't exactly, well, you know how he was about money. Everything goes to Mom anyway." Margaret nodded, approvingly. "Robert was very clear about his priorities in his final years. His real family came first." Before I could respond, Mr. Thompson entered the room. He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect. He carried a thick manila folder and what appeared to be a sealed envelope. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming." He took his seat at the head of the table and opened the folder. "As you know, we're here for the reading of Robert Mitchell's last will and testament, dated March 15th of this year." March 15th. Just 5 months ago. Dad had updated his will recently, which seemed odd. Why would he have made changes so close to his death? "Before we begin," Mr. Thompson continued, "I want you to know that this document was prepared with great care and consideration. Robert spent considerable time ensuring that his wishes were clearly articulated and legally sound." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer than the others. "Are there any questions before we proceed?" Margaret shifted impatiently. "Can we just get on with it? We all know what it says." Mr. Thompson smiled. Slightly. "Do we? Well, let's find out." The conference room felt smaller somehow as Mr. Thompson opened the will. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed almost surreal. I found myself studying the faces around the table, trying to read their expressions. Margaret sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a black designer dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, and her makeup was flawless despite the fact that she was supposedly in mourning. There was something in her eyes, a confidence, almost smugness, that suggested she had no doubt about what the will contained. David had that same confidence, but his was more obvious. He kept checking his expensive watch and glancing at his phone, as if this was just an inconvenient formality keeping him from more important things. I remembered Margaret mentioning that he'd been working at the construction company for the past few years, though working was probably a generous term for whatever he actually did there. Emma seemed nervous, but then again, Emma had always been the most emotional of Margaret's children. She kept twisting her wedding ring. I'd heard through the small-town gossip network that she'd married her college boyfriend 2 years ago in an elaborate ceremony that Dad had paid for. She caught me looking at her and offered another one of those weak smiles. "This is really awkward," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I mean, we barely know each other anymore." It was true. The last time I'd had a real conversation. With Emma, she'd been in high school, worried about some boy who didn't like her back. Now she was a married woman with a life I knew nothing about. The thought made me sad in a way I hadn't expected. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. "As I mentioned, this will was prepared recently and reflects Robert's current wishes regarding the distribution of his estate." He pulled out a pair of reading glasses and positioned them carefully on his nose. "The estate, I should mention, is quite substantial. Robert built his construction business into one of the most successful enterprises in the region." Margaret's smile grew wider. "I'd known Dad's business was doing well. You couldn't drive through town without seeing Mitchell construction signs at various development sites, but I hadn't realized it was that successful. The total value of the estate," Mr. Thompson continued, "including the business, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and liquid assets, is approximately $12 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $12 million. I had no idea Dad had accumulated that kind of wealth. When I was growing up, we'd been comfortable but not wealthy. We'd lived in a nice house, taken modest vacations, never wanted for anything essential, but nothing had suggested this level of financial success." David let out a low whistle. "12 million? Seriously?" "The business really took off in the last decade," Margaret said, her voice taking on a proprietary tone. "Robert was an excellent businessman, very strategic about expansion and investments." There was something about the way she said it that bothered me, as if she was claiming credit for Dad's success. But I pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about me anyway. I was just here for whatever small remembrance Dad had left me, and then I could go back to Chicago and leave them to their inheritance. "Now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "let me read the relevant portions of the will. I, Robert Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament." The legal language that followed was dense and complicated, full of clauses about debts and taxes and executor responsibilities. I found my attention drifting as Mr. Thompson worked through the technical sections. Outside the window, I could see people walking down Main Street, going about their normal lives, unaware that inside this conference room, a family's entire future was being decided. Margaret and David were listening intently, occasionally nodding to each other as if confirming their expectations. Emma continued to fidget with her wedding ring, her eyes darting between Mr. Thompson and the rest of us. "And now we come to the distribution of assets," Mr. Thompson announced, and the room seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the moment when Margaret would officially inherit the house, the business, the money. David would probably get a substantial amount, maybe even a position as head of the company. Emma would get her share too, and I would get, what, a few $1,000s? Some piece of jewelry? Mr. Thompson looked around the table once more, his expression unreadable. "To my beloved wife Margaret, who has been a devoted companion during my later years, I leave the sum of $50,000 and the right to remain in the family home for a period of 6 months following my death." Wait, $50,000? That seemed small. And 6 months in the house? Why wouldn't she inherit the house outright? Margaret's confident smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, did you say 50,000? To my stepson, David Mitchell," Mr. Thompson continued, "I leave the sum of $25,000 in recognition of his contributions to the family business." David's face went pale. 25,000? But what about the business? What about, "To my stepdaughter, Emma Mitchell Harrison, I leave the sum of $25,000 with my hopes that she will use it wisely for her future." Emma's mouth fell open. But what about the rest? What about the house? The company?" Mr. Thompson removed his glasses and looked directly at me. "To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, I leave the remainder of my estate, including Mitchell Construction Company, all real estate holdings, investment accounts, and liquid assets. I also name her as the executor of this will and trustee of all family trusts." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room, as if gravity had suddenly stopped working. $12 million. The business. Everything. Dad had left me everything. "That's impossible," Margaret said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "There must be some mistake." But Mr. Thompson was already reaching for the sealed envelope. "There's more." Robert left a personal letter to be read at this time. The explosion came instantly. "This is fraud!" Margaret shot to her feet, her composed facade cracking completely. "Robert would never, he couldn't have, this is impossible." David was right behind her, his face flushed red with anger. "Are you kidding me? She hasn't been part of this family for years. She didn't even come to the funeral." "Because you banned me," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over their shouting. "This has to be a mistake," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "Dad wouldn't do this to us. We're his real children. We took care of him." The words hit me like physical blows, but I couldn't process them properly. My mind was still reeling from what Mr. Thompson had read. $12 million. The entire estate. It didn't make sense. Why would Dad leave me everything when he'd barely spoken to me in years? Margaret whirled on Mr. Thompson, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing in his direction. "You did this, didn't you? You convinced a sick old man to change his will. This is elder abuse, and I'll see you disbarred for it." Mr. Thompson remained perfectly calm, which only seemed to enrage her further. "Mrs. Mitchell, I can assure you that your husband was of completely sound mind when he made these changes. In fact, he insisted on having a psychological evaluation completed before signing, specifically to prevent any challenges to his mental competency." "When?" David demanded. "When did he change it?" "Because I was with him every day at the office, and he never mentioned anything about this." "The will was updated on March 15th, Mr. Thompson replied. "Robert came to my office alone and spent several hours going through every detail. He was very specific about his wishes." "March 15th, Margaret repeated, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. "That was right after—" She stopped herself, but David picked up the thread. "Right after what, Mom?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." But her voice had lost its certainty. I was still sitting in stunned silence, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. This couldn't be real. Dad had chosen Margaret's children over me for 15 years. He'd missed my graduation, my achievements, every important moment of my life. Why would he suddenly leave me everything? "There has to be a previous will," Emma said desperately. "What about the will he made when he married Mom? That has to be the real one." Mr. Thompson nodded. "There was indeed a previous will. dated 2019. In that document, Margaret was the primary beneficiary, with David and Emma receiving substantial inheritances as well. Sarah was mentioned only briefly, receiving a modest sum. See? Margaret's voice was triumphant. That's the real will. This is obviously some kind of forgery. However, Mr. Thompson continued, that will was legally superseded by the current document. Robert was very clear that he wanted to make changes, and he provided detailed reasoning for his decisions. What reasoning? David's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. What possible reason could he have for cutting out his real family? Mr. Thompson picked up the sealed envelope again. Perhaps his letter will explain. Robert specifically requested that this be read after the will, regardless of the family's reaction. Don't you dare, Margaret snapped. Whatever lies he wrote in there, whatever manipulation. I'm afraid I'm legally obligated to read it, Mr. Thompson said firmly. This was Robert's final wish. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out several handwritten pages. Even from across the table, I could see Dad's familiar scrawl, the same handwriting that had signed report cards and birthday cards throughout my childhood. My dear family, Mr. Thompson began, if you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and you have just learned about my final wishes regarding my estate. I know this comes as a shock, particularly to Margaret, David, and Emma, and I want to explain my reasoning. Margaret started to interrupt, but Mr. Thompson held up a hand. Please, let me finish. This was very important to Robert. For the past 15 years, I have watched my daughter Sarah be systematically excluded from our family. I told myself it was natural, that blended families were complicated, that everyone needed time to adjust. But I was wrong, and I was a coward for not speaking up. The words hung heavy in the air. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes. But I blinked them back. I wouldn't give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Sarah was never invited to family dinners unless I specifically insisted. Her achievements were dismissed or ignored, while David and Emma's every accomplishment was celebrated. When she graduated summa cum laude from college, Margaret told me it wasn't worth attending because she was just showing off. When Sarah called to tell me about her first article being published in a national magazine, Margaret rolled her eyes and said, "How nice, dear," before immediately changing the subject to Emma's latest drama. Emma flinched at that, her face crumpling further. I watched my daughter grow up feeling unwanted in her own home, and I did nothing to stop it. I was so afraid of losing Margaret and her children that I allowed my own flesh and blood to be treated like an outsider. That is the greatest regret of my life. This is ridiculous, David muttered, but his voice lacked conviction now. Mr. Thompson continued reading. I have spent the last year watching all of you more carefully, and I finally see the truth I was too blind to acknowledge. Margaret, you have been spending money we didn't discuss, thousands of dollars on shopping trips, spa visits, and investments that benefit only you. David, you show up to work when you feel like it, spend more time gambling online than doing actual work, and have borrowed against your future inheritance 3 times in the past 2 years. Emma, you have been to rehab twice for prescription drug addiction, and both times you manipulated me into paying for expensive private facilities while lying about the severity of your problems. The accusations hit like bombs. Margaret's face had gone white. David was staring at the table, and Emma was sobbing openly now. Meanwhile, Sarah built a successful career entirely on her own. She never asked me for money, never expected special treatment, never demanded anything from me, despite having every right to feel abandoned. She became the strong, independent woman her mother always hoped she would be, and she did it without any help from the family that should have supported her. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They streamed down my face as Mr. Thompson's voice filled the room with my father's final words, words I'd waited my entire adult life to hear. Mr. Thompson paused to let the weight of Dad's words settle before continuing. The room was thick with tension, broken only by Emma's quiet sobs and the sound of traffic from the street below. Sarah, he continued, if you are hearing this, then you know I have left you everything. This is not meant as punishment for the others, though I suspect they will see it that way. This is meant as an apology, inadequate though it may be, for 15 years of failing you as a father. My breath caught in my throat. Even through Mr. Thompson's measured voice, I could hear Dad speaking to me, Could imagine him sitting at his desk late at night, struggling with these words. I know you probably think I didn't notice your absence from family gatherings, your gradual withdrawal from our lives. The truth is, I noticed everything. I noticed that you stopped calling on Father's Day. I noticed that you didn't come home. For Christmas last year, I noticed that when I mentioned your name at dinner, Margaret would change the subject, and David and Emma would look uncomfortable. Margaret's hands were clenched into fists on the table. Robert was sick, she said desperately. He wasn't thinking clearly. This isn't what he really wanted. Mr. Thompson ignored her interruption. I want you to know that I kept track of your achievements, even when I couldn't celebrate them with you. I have copies of every article you've published, printouts of every award you've won. I know about the investigative series that won you the State Journalism Award. I know about your promotion to senior writer. I know about the book proposal you submitted last month. How could he have known about the book proposal? I'd only sent it to 3 publishers, and I hadn't told anyone in the family about it. The realization that Dad had been quietly following my career from a distance was overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson has been my eyes and ears regarding your life. Sarah, she updates me regularly on your accomplishments, and she was the one who finally convinced me to take action. She told me that you came into the art supply store last Christmas when you were visiting, and you looked so sad, so lost. She said you asked about me, wondered if I ever mentioned you. When she told you that I did, that I was proud of you, you started crying right there in the store. I remembered that day. I'd been walking around town, trying to work up the courage to call Dad, when I'd impulsively stopped in to see Mrs. Henderson. She'd been so kind, so warm, and when she'd mentioned that Dad spoke of me fondly, I'd broken down completely. I'd had no idea she was reporting back to him. That's when I knew I had to make things right, or at least try to. I hired a private investigator to document the financial irregularities I'd begun to suspect. Margaret, you might be interested to know that your shopping therapy has cost our family over $300,000 in the past 3 years. The gambling debts you covered for David totaled another $150,000. And Emma's rehab stays, along with the money you've been giving her to get back on her feet, has exceeded $200,000. David's head snapped up. You hired a private investigator? You spied on your own family? I also discovered that none of you seemed particularly concerned about my health. The letter continued. Margaret, when I told you about the chest pains I'd been having, you suggested I was probably just stressed about work and should take some antacids. David, when I mentioned feeling dizzy and short of breath, you said I was getting old and should retire so you could take over the business. Emma, you were so focused on your own problems that I don't think you noticed I was struggling at all. Emma's sobs grew louder. That's not fair. I was dealing with my addiction. I was sick too. But when Mrs. Henderson mentioned that I looked tired, she insisted I see a doctor. When the diagnosis came back, advanced heart disease, probably genetic, the same condition that killed my father. She was the one who sat with me in the doctor's office and helped me understand what it meant. Advanced heart disease. Dad had been sick, really sick, and none of us had known. Well, none of them had known. Mrs. Henderson had known. Mrs. Henderson had cared enough to pay attention. The doctor gave me 6 months to a year, depending on how well I responded to treatment. That was 4 months ago. I decided not to tell the family because I wanted to see how you would all behave if you didn't know time was running out. The results were enlightening. Margaret was shaking her head vigorously. This is insane. He was paranoid, delusional. The illness affected his judgment. Margaret increased her spending significantly once I started working from home more often. She seemed to interpret my presence as an opportunity to redecorate again, this time with an even more expensive designer. David started showing up to work even less frequently, telling employees that his father was losing his edge and that big changes were coming soon. Emma called more often, but only when she needed money for various emergencies that were probably drug-related. The accuracy of these observations was devastating. Even I could see the truth in them, and I'd been completely absent from the family dynamics. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to live her life with integrity and independence. She didn't know I was sick because we had grown so far apart, but that distance was my fault, not hers. I realized that if I wanted to repair our relationship, I needed to take the first step. I needed to show her that she mattered to me, that she had always mattered. This inheritance is not just money, Sarah. It's my faith in you, my belief that you will use these resources wisely and kindly. It's my hope that you can forgive a foolish old man who took too long to stand up for his daughter. And it's my way of ensuring that you will never again have to feel excluded from your own family's legacy. To Margaret, David, and Emma, I hope you understand that this decision comes from love, not malice. You have all received substantial sums that will allow you to start fresh, to build lives based on your own efforts rather than expectations of inheritance. I hope you will use this opportunity to become the people I always believed you could be. Mr. Thompson looked up from the letter. There's a bit more, but it's personal instructions for Sarah about the business and various accounts. He folded the pages carefully. I think Robert's intentions are quite clear. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and rage. David was staring at his hands, all his earlier bluster gone. Emma continued to cry, but her sobs had become quieter, more resigned, and I sat there, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions crashing over me. Grief for the father I'd lost, just as I was learning how much he'd actually loved me. Anger at the years we'd wasted, the misunderstandings that had kept us apart, and something else, a strange sense of vindication, of finally being seen and valued for who I really was. This isn't over, Margaret said finally, her voice low and dangerous. I don't care what that letter says. I'll contest this will. I'll prove he wasn't competent. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson interrupted gently. I should mention that. Robert anticipated this reaction. The will includes provisions for any legal challenges, and he's arranged for the full documentation of his mental competency evaluation to be available to the court if needed. He was very thorough. Margaret's face crumpled then, the full reality finally hitting her. The inheritance she'd counted on, the financial security she'd assumed was hers, was gone. And there was nothing she could do about it. The dam broke completely then. Margaret's carefully constructed composure shattered like glass, and the woman, who had controlled our household for 15 years, transformed into someone I barely recognized. You manipulative little bitch, she screamed, lunging toward me across the table. You did this somehow. You got to him, poisoned him against us. Mr. Thompson quickly moved between us, his voice sharp with authority. Mrs. Mitchell, please control yourself, or I'll have to ask you to leave. But Margaret was beyond reason now. 15 years! 15 years I devoted to that man, to his children, to building a life together. I gave up my own career, my own independence. And for what? So some ungrateful brat who couldn't even be bothered to visit could waltz in and steal everything? I didn't steal anything, I said, finding my voice at last. I didn't even know— Don't! David slammed his hand down on the table, making everyone jump. Don't you dare act innocent. You think we're stupid? You think we don't know you've been planning this? The accusation was so absurd, I almost laughed. Planning what? I haven't spoken to Dad in 2 years. I was excluded from his funeral. How exactly could I have planned anything? You had that old woman helping you, Emma said through her tears. Mrs. Henderson. She was spying on us, reporting back to you. Mrs. Henderson barely knows me, I protested. I've maybe talked to her a dozen times in my entire life. But David was shaking his head, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This is bullshit. Complete bullshit. I've been working at that company for 8 years. I know every client, every project, every employee. I've earned the right to inherit it by showing up when you felt like it. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was tired of being attacked. By gambling away money Dad had to cover for you? That's none of your business, David shot back. Those were private family matters. You weren't part of this family. You made that choice. I made that choice. Now I was getting angry too. I was 14 when you moved into my house. I was a grieving child who just lost her mother, and instead of getting support, I got a stepmother who made it clear I was unwelcome, and step-siblings who treated me like an inconvenience. Margaret's laugh was bitter and harsh. Oh, please. The poor little orphan act. You were impossible from day one, sullen, uncooperative, constantly throwing your dead mother in my face. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. I was a child mourning my mother. You were a spoiled brat who refused to accept that your father had moved on and found happiness. Happiness? I stood up then, my hands shaking. Is that what you call it? Because from where I sat, it looked like Dad traded his relationship with his only biological child for a woman who spent his money and children who only cared about what they could get from him. Emma flinched at that, but David's response was immediate and vicious. At least we were here. At least we cared enough to stick around instead of running off to play big city journalist. I left because there was nothing here for me. The words exploded out of me. 15 years of hurt and resentment finally finding their voice. Every family dinner where I was ignored, every holiday where my opinions didn't matter, every achievement that was dismissed while yours were celebrated. Why would I stay for that? Because family doesn't abandon family, Margaret said coldly. Real family supports each other through difficult times instead of cutting and running when things get complicated. Real family doesn't exclude someone from their father's funeral. I shot back. The room went silent at that. Even Emma stopped crying for a moment. It was the one thing they couldn't argue with. The one action that had been so blatantly cruel that even they seemed to recognize it. Margaret recovered first, her voice taking on a defensive edge. That funeral was for people who actually loved Robert, people who were part of his daily life. You showing up would have been disrespectful to his memory. I was his daughter. You were his daughter by blood only, David said. Emma and I were his real children. We lived with him, worked with him, took care of him when he was sick. Took care of him? I turned to face David directly. According to that letter, none of you even noticed he was dying. He hid it from us, Emma protested. If you'd known what? Would you have spent less money? Would David have shown up to work more often? Would you have paid attention to something other than your own problems for 5 minutes? Emma's face crumpled again, but this time it looked less like grief and more like shame. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, reminding us all that we had an audience for this family meltdown. Perhaps we should adjourn for today. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Mitchell, Miss Harrison, you have the right to obtain legal counsel if you wish to challenge the will. However, I should inform you that Robert was very thorough in his preparations. The psychological evaluation I mentioned was conducted by Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state. Her report clearly establishes his mental competency at the time the will was changed. Margaret's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. Money makes people do terrible things, and I'm sure Sarah found a way to influence that evaluation too. The paranoia in her voice was almost pathetic. She couldn't accept that Dad had made this decision on his own, that his careful observation of his family's behavior had led him to conclude that I was the most deserving heir. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson said patiently, Sarah wasn't present for any of the will preparation. She had no contact with Robert during the process, no communication with my office, and no knowledge of the psychological evaluation. Your husband made these decisions entirely independently. I don't believe that, Margaret said flatly. There has to be more to this story. People don't just cut out their families for no reason. Maybe the reason is exactly what he wrote in that letter, I said quietly. Maybe he finally saw what I'd been seeing all along. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Come on, Mom, we don't have to listen to this anymore. We'll get our own lawyer and we'll fight this thing properly. Emma hesitated, looking between her family and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment I thought she might stay, might try to bridge the gap that had opened between us. But then Margaret took her arm firmly. Emma, we're leaving. Now. As they filed out of the conference room, Margaret turned back to me one last time. Enjoy it while you can, Sarah. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving me alone with Mr. Thompson and the overwhelming reality of my new situation. I was now worth $12 million, and I had no idea what to do next. After the chaos of Margaret's departure, the conference room felt eerily quiet. Mr. Thompson was gathering his papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had witnessed many family dramas over the years, but his expression suggested this one had been particularly intense. That was explosive, he said diplomatically. Are you all right, Miss Mitchell? I wasn't sure how to answer that. Was I all right? I just inherited $12 million from a father I'd barely spoken to in years. been screamed at by a stepfamily who blamed me for their misfortune, and learned that my father had been secretly documenting their behavior while dying of heart disease. All right, didn't seem to cover it. I think I need some air, I managed. Of course, but before you go, there are a few more things your father wanted you to know. Mr. Thompson pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Robert left detailed instructions about various accounts, business operations, and other matters he thought you should be aware of. Something in his tone made me sit back down. Other matters? Your father was quite thorough in his investigation of the family's financial activities. He hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a retired police detective who specializes in financial fraud cases. The report makes for interesting reading. He handed me a bound document that was easily 50 pages long. The cover page was simple. Financial Investigation Report, Mitchell Family Activities, January 2023, March 2024. Your father became suspicious when he noticed unexplained charges on various accounts, Mr. Thompson explained. What started as casual concern became serious alarm when he realized the scope of the irregularities. I flipped through the first few pages, my eyes widening at the detailed documentation. Bank statements, credit card records, photographs, even surveillance reports. Dad hadn't just been watching, he'd been building a case. Margaret's activities are particularly well documented, Mr. Thompson noted. The shopping trips to Atlanta that she claimed were business-related real estate conferences? They were actually weekend gambling excursions to Cherokee Casino. The receipts show losses of nearly $80,000 over 18 months. I stared at a photograph of Margaret at a blackjack table, a stack of chips in front of her, looking nothing like the grieving widow who'd just screamed at me about family loyalty. The interior designer she hired to redecorate the house last year, that was her brother-in-law, and he charged twice the market rate for furniture and services while giving Margaret kickbacks. Your father discovered the arrangement when he found cash deposits in her personal account that couldn't be explained. Page after page revealed a pattern of deception and financial manipulation that went far beyond what Dad's letter had mentioned. Margaret hadn't just been overspending. She'd been systematically defrauding the family accounts while presenting herself as a devoted wife managing the household budget. David's situation is equally concerning, Mr. Thompson continued. The gambling debts your father mentioned, they were just the beginning. He's been using his position at the company to steal equipment and materials, selling them to competitors at a discount and pocketing the money. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of David loading company equipment into his personal truck, records of materials that were ordered but never arrived at job sites, testimony from employees who'd witnessed questionable activities but were afraid to report them because David was the boss's son. Emma's prescription drug addiction led her to forge her father's signature on checks from the business account, Mr. Thompson said quietly. She's withdrawn over $45,000 in the past year alone, supposedly for legitimate business expenses that never occurred. I felt sick reading about Emma's desperate attempts to fund her addiction. Forged checks, stolen prescription pads from doctors' offices during her various appointments, even selling family jewelry that she claimed had been lost or damaged. The woman who'd sobbed about being Dad's real daughter had been robbing him blind while he was dying. There's more, Mr. Thompson said, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just your father's former secretary, Sarah. She never stopped working for him. After Margaret convinced him to hire a new office manager, he kept Mrs. Henderson on as a private consultant, paying her personally to monitor the company's operations and the family's activities. That explained so much. Mrs. Henderson's detailed knowledge of my life, her presence at the funeral, her mysterious comment about Dad's final message. She'd been his eyes and ears, documenting everything while maintaining her cover as a retired employee who occasionally stopped by the art store. She'll be coming to see you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson continued. Your father left specific instructions for her to provide you with additional information about the business operations and his personal effects. I was still absorbing the magnitude of what I was reading when Mr. Thompson handed me another document, this one with my name on it. Your father also left this psychological profile, prepared by Dr. Williams during their sessions. He wanted you to understand not just what the family was doing, but why he believed they were doing it. The psychological assessment was brutal in its honesty. Dr. Williams had interviewed Dad extensively about his family dynamics, and her conclusions painted a picture of a household built on manipulation, entitlement, and emotional abuse. Margaret exhibits classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder, I read aloud from the report. Her need for constant admiration, her lack of empathy for others, her belief that she's entitled to special treatment. These traits became more pronounced as she gained financial security through her marriage. She appears to view her husband's resources as her own by right, rather than by privilege. The assessment of David was equally damning. Displays antisocial tendencies including lack of remorse for harmful actions, disregard for social norms, and persistent lying. His sense of entitlement appears to stem from years of being shielded from consequences for his behavior. Emma's profile was perhaps the saddest, shows signs of dependent personality disorder complicated by substance abuse. Her addiction appears to be both a coping mechanism for feelings of inadequacy and a way of maintaining attention and sympathy from family members. She has learned to weaponize her vulnerability. Your father wanted you to understand that their behavior wasn't personal, Mr. Thompson explained. Dr. Williams helped him see that these patterns had been developing for years, long before his illness. The money and inheritance were just the catalyst that revealed their true priorities. I closed the psychological report, feeling overwhelmed by the clinical dissection of family members I'd lived with for years without really understanding. How long did Dad know about all of this? The investigation began in earnest about 18 months ago, but he told Dr. Williams he'd been having doubts for much longer. He said the turning point came when he realized you'd stopped calling home, and when he asked Margaret about it, she said you were probably too busy with your little writing hobby to care about family. The casual cruelty of that dismissal was so typically Margaret that I could hear her saying it. That's when he started paying attention to how you were actually treated during family interactions. He realized that you weren't being difficult or distant. You were protecting yourself from a toxic environment. Mr. Thompson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Your father spent his final months trying to figure out how to make amends for years of allowing this treatment to continue. The inheritance was his way of saying he was sorry, but it was also his way of ensuring that you would never again be at their mercy. I thought about Dad in those final months, quietly documenting his family's betrayals while his heart literally failed him. The loneliness he must have felt, the disappointment, the guilt over his own role in creating this mess. Mrs. Henderson. We'll have more details tomorrow, Mr. Thompson said, returning to his seat. But I wanted you to understand the full scope of what your father discovered before you have to make any decisions about how to proceed. What kinds of decisions? His smile was grim. Whether to press charges for the theft and fraud for one thing. The evidence is more than sufficient for criminal prosecution if you choose to pursue it. The next morning, I sat in the hotel restaurant, staring at my untouched breakfast while trying to process everything I'd learned. $12 million wasn't just a number. It represented a complete transformation of my life, my identity, my future. But more than that, it represented my father's final attempt to show me that I mattered. Mrs. Henderson arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of use. She was dressed in a simple navy dress, her gray hair pulled back in the same careful bun I remembered from my childhood visits to the art store. But there was something different about her now, a sense of purpose, of importance, that I'd never noticed before. "Sarah, dear," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I hope you got some sleep. Yesterday was quite overwhelming, I'm sure." "Not much sleep," I admitted. "I keep thinking about everything in that report." "How long have you known about all of it?" She opened her briefcase and pulled out several manila folders. "I've been documenting irregularities for about 2 years, but I started noticing problems much earlier. Your father was a good man, but he was also a trusting man. He didn't want to believe the people he loved were taking advantage of him." "Tell me about the business," I said. "I know Dad built it into something substantial, but I don't really understand what I've inherited." Mrs. Henderson smiled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, it was a genuinely warm expression. "Oh, Sarah, you've inherited something remarkable. Your father didn't just build a construction company, he built an empire." She spread out financial documents across the table between us. Mitchell Construction currently employs 127 people across 3 divisions: residential construction, commercial development, and infrastructure projects. Last year's gross revenue was $47 million, with a net profit of nearly $8 million. The numbers were staggering. I'd known Dad was successful, but this level of success was beyond anything I'd imagined. The residential division builds custom homes, primarily in the $500,000 to $2 million range, Mrs. Henderson continued. We have a waiting list that extends 18 months out, and our reputation for quality means we can charge premium prices. The commercial division is even more profitable. We've built everything from shopping centers to office complexes to medical facilities. The new hospital wing they just completed? That was a $12 million project with a 22% profit margin. I was scribbling notes, trying to keep up with the flood of information. And the infrastructure projects? Government contracts primarily. Road construction, bridge repair, municipal building projects. It's steady work with guaranteed payment, though the profit margins are smaller. Your father bid on these projects as a way to keep the crew busy during slower periods in the other divisions. She pulled out another set of documents. But the real value is in the real estate holdings. Your father was incredibly smart about acquiring land. Every time the company completed a project, he'd look for adjacent properties that might become valuable as the area developed. The property list was extensive. Vacant lots in up-and-coming neighborhoods, commercial buildings that were rented out to other businesses, even a small apartment complex that provided steady rental income. The total real estate portfolio is currently valued at approximately $6.2 million, Mrs. Henderson said. But several of these properties are likely to appreciate significantly over the next few years as development continues to expand outward from the city center. What about the investment accounts? I asked. Your father was conservative but smart with his investments. He preferred index funds and blue-chip stocks to more speculative ventures. The investment portfolio is worth about $2.1 million currently, and it's been growing steadily for years. She handed me another folder. This contains all the banking information, account numbers, and contact details for the various financial institutions. Your father also maintained business relationships with 3 different banks, which has been crucial for securing construction loans and managing cash flow. The scope of what I'd inherited was overwhelming. This wasn't just money. It was a complex business operation that employed over 100 people and generated millions of dollars in revenue annually. Mrs. Henderson, I said carefully, I don't know anything about running a construction company. I'm a journalist. What am I supposed to do with all of this? Her smile was reassuring. Your father anticipated that concern. He spent considerable time over the past year documenting every aspect of the business operations and creating detailed succession plans. She pulled out a thick binder. This contains step-by-step instructions for managing the day-to-day operations, contact information for key employees and subcontractors, and detailed financial procedures. He also recorded video messages explaining various aspects of the business. Video messages? He wanted to make sure you'd have his guidance even after he was gone. There are 12 videos covering everything from bidding on projects to managing employee relations to handling client complaints. He recorded them in his home office over the past few months. The idea of Dad sitting alone in his office, dying of heart disease while recording instructional videos for a daughter he barely spoke to, was almost too much to bear. But more importantly, Mrs. Henderson continued, you won't be managing this alone. Your father retained the services of 3 key employees who can handle the operational aspects while you learn the business. She pointed to names on an organizational chart. Frank Morrison has been the construction foreman for 15 years. He knows every aspect of the building process and has the complete trust of the crew. Patricia Williams, not the psychologist, a different Patricia, is the office manager who replaced me officially, but has been working closely with me to ensure continuity. And James Butler is the project manager who handles client relations and bidding. They know about the inheritance. They know you've inherited the business, and they're all excited to work with you. Frank in particular has been hoping for years that you might come back and get involved with the company. He remembers you from when you were little and used to visit job sites with your father. That stirred a memory I'd forgotten. Summer days when Dad would take me to construction sites, letting me wear a hard hat and watch the crews work. I'd been fascinated by the process of building something from nothing, the way a pile of materials could become a house or an office building through careful planning and skilled labor. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your father left specific instructions about Margaret and the children. He knew they would likely challenge the will, and he wanted you to be prepared." She handed me a sealed envelope. "This contains documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every theft, every lie that he discovered during his investigation. If they choose to fight you legally, you have more than enough evidence to not only defend your inheritance, but to pursue criminal charges if necessary." The weight of that envelope felt heavier than all the financial documents combined. The power to destroy my stepfamily's lives, to send them to prison, to completely ruin their futures. It was the ultimate revenge for 15 years of exclusion and cruelty. "What would Dad want me to do?" I asked. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "He hoped you would be better than they were, Sarah. He hoped you would use this power wisely and compassionately, even though they never showed you the same consideration." I tucked the envelope into my purse, unsure whether it felt more like a weapon or a burden. "Now," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone becoming more businesslike, "we need to discuss your immediate plans. The business needs direction. There are pending projects that require decisions, and there are legal matters to address. How long can you stay in town?" I had barely finished breakfast with Mrs. Henderson when my phone started ringing. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, Margaret's voice came through clear and angry. "Sarah, we need to talk. This whole situation is ridiculous, and I think if we sit down like adults, we can work something out." Her tone was completely different from the day before, controlled, almost sweet. The transformation was so sudden it was unsettling. "I'm not sure there's anything to work out, Margaret. Dad made his wishes pretty clear." Robert wasn't thinking straight. "You have to understand that. He was sick, confused, probably being manipulated by people who had their own agendas." She paused, and I could hear the calculated nature of her words. "But you're a reasonable person, Sarah. You know this inheritance isn't right. We can fix this if we work together." "Fix this how?" "Well, obviously you deserve something. You're his daughter, after all. I'm thinking we could divide everything more fairly. Say, 25% for you, and the rest split between the people who actually took care of him in his final years." 25%. She was offering me a quarter of what my father had legally left me and making it sound like she was being generous. "Margaret, the will is legal and final. I'm not interested in negotiations." "Don't be foolish, Sarah." The sweetness was already fading from her voice. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything? This is our town, our community. People know us, trust us. You're nobody here, a stranger who abandoned her family and came back only when money was involved." "I didn't abandon anyone. I was excluded, remember? Including from Dad's funeral." "That's going to change, you know," she said, ignoring my response entirely. "Once people hear the real story, once they understand what kind of person you really are, you'll find it very difficult to operate that business. Our business connections, our reputation in the community, you'll need all of that if you want to succeed." The threat was clear, even wrapped in her pseudo-reasonable tone. She was planning to wage a campaign to destroy my reputation and sabotage the business if I didn't give her what she wanted. "Are you threatening me, Margaret?" "I'm just explaining reality, dear. This town is like a family, and family takes care of family. People who try to hurt family, well, they don't tend to thrive here." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Within 15 minutes, it rang. Again. This time, it was David. "Sarah, look, I think Mom came on a little strong yesterday. We're all still processing this, you know? But I've been thinking about it, and maybe we can make this work for everyone." "How's that, David?" "Well, you don't know anything about running a construction company, right? I mean, no offense, but you're a writer. This is a multi-million-dollar business with hundreds of employees and complicated contracts. You could lose everything if you don't know what you're doing." "I'm listening. So here's what I'm thinking. You keep the title, you keep majority ownership, but I run the day-to-day operations. I already know the business. I have relationships with all the clients. The crew respects me. We split the profit 60-40, you get the bigger share since you're technically the owner, and everybody wins. The audacity was breathtaking. He wanted me to hand over control of the company to him while giving him 40% of the profits for the privilege of doing so. That's an interesting proposal, David, but I'm going to decline. Come on, Sarah, be realistic. You can't just jump into this industry with no experience and expect to succeed. The construction business is tough, it's male-dominated, and it requires respect that takes years to build. You'll destroy everything Dad worked for. I'll take my chances. His tone hardened immediately. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. You're going to fail, and when you do, don't expect us to bail you out. Emma called an hour later, and her approach was entirely different. She was crying before she even said hello. Sarah, I'm so sorry. About yesterday. I was just so shocked and hurt, and I said things I didn't mean. You have to understand, this whole situation is tearing our family apart. Emma, I know you probably think we're terrible people, and maybe we haven't always been fair to you. But we're still family. We grew up together. We shared holidays and birthdays and all those memories. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Her emotional manipulation was more subtle than Margaret's threats or David's business proposals, but it was manipulation nonetheless. She was trying to make me feel guilty for accepting what Dad had legally left me. I don't want to hurt anyone, Emma, but I'm not going to apologize for Dad's decisions. But you could change them, couldn't you? I mean, you could share some of it, help us out. You know about my problems, my addiction. I'm trying so hard to get clean, but the stress of this situation, the financial pressure, it's making everything so much harder. Emma, you received $25,000. That's not nothing. $25,000 doesn't go very far when you have medical bills and treatment costs, and she dissolved into sobs again. I just thought Dad loved me. I thought I mattered to him. Finding out that he knew about my problems and just wrote me off, it's destroying me. He didn't write you off. He gave you enough money to get the help you need and start over, but not enough to matter. Not enough to show that I was really his daughter. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma alternating between tears, guilt trips, and subtle threats about how my selfishness was going to destroy the family forever. By the time I hung up, I felt emotionally drained and slightly nauseous. The calls continued throughout the day, friends of the family offering to mediate the situation. Distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly concerned about family unity. Even the pastor from St. Mary's called to suggest that perhaps Christian forgiveness and charity should guide my decisions about the inheritance. By evening, I realized what was happening. Margaret had initiated a coordinated campaign to pressure me into sharing the inheritance. She was mobilizing every social and emotional connection she could find to make my life uncomfortable until I gave in to their demands. But Dad had anticipated this too. Mrs. Henderson called me that evening with advice that was both practical and empowering. Your father went through something similar when he first started the business, she said. Competitors tried to undermine him. Suppliers tried to pressure him, clients tried to manipulate him. He learned that the only way to succeed was to stand firm on his principles and let his work speak for itself. This feels different, though. These are family members, are they? Because family members don't typically threaten your reputation and sabotage your business when they don't get their way. What you're dealing with now is exactly what your father dealt with from them for years. Emotional blackmail disguised as concern. That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I wasn't going to be bullied or manipulated into giving up what Dad had left me. I wasn't going to apologize for his choices or feel guilty about accepting his final gift. I was going to stand my ground, and I was going to prove that his faith in me was justified. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson picked me up at the hotel with a set of keys and an address I recognized immediately. My childhood home, the house where my mother had taught me to bake cookies, where my father had read me bedtime stories, where I'd taken my first steps and said my first words. Your father wanted you to see something, she said, as we pulled into the familiar driveway, something Margaret never knew he kept. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but that was probably just perspective. Margaret had updated the Heir exterior with modern landscaping and a fresh coat of paint in trendy gray tones that erased any trace of my mother's warm, welcoming style. Even the front door had been changed, from the cheerful red my mother had loved to a stark black with contemporary hardware. We entered through the side door that led into the kitchen, and I was immediately struck by how sterile everything felt. Gone were my mother's colorful curtains, her collection of vintage mixing bowls displayed on open shelves, the herb garden visible through the window above the sink. In their place was a showroom-perfect space with granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and not a single personal touch. Margaret redecorated 3 times in 15 years, Mrs. Henderson said, noticing my expression. Each time removing more traces of your mother's presence. But your father, he saved things Margaret never knew about. She led me upstairs to what had once been Dad's home office. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood furniture, built-in bookshelves, the old leather chair where he used to sit and review blueprints. It was the one room in the house that seemed untouched by Margaret's renovations. Mrs. Henderson walked to the bookshelf and pressed something behind a row of construction manuals. A section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment I never would have suspected existed. Your father had this installed about 5 years ago, she explained. Margaret thought he was just updating the office storage. Inside, the hidden space was a shrine to my mother that took my breath away. Photographs of her that had disappeared from the rest of the house. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, enveloping me in a bear hug that smelled like sawdust and coffee. "Look at you, all grown up and successful. Your dad used to show me your articles, you know, bragged about you constantly." "He did? Oh, honey, you were—" all he talked about some days. "My Sarah's investigating corruption in City Hall," he'd say, or, "My Sarah just got promoted to senior writer." We all knew how proud he was, even when— he paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Even when I wasn't around to hear it? Even when family politics made it complicated for him to say so directly." Frank's diplomatic way of addressing the Margaret situation told me he understood more about the family dynamics than he was letting on. "Come on," he said, holding the door open for me. "Let me show you what your daddy built here." The office was bustling with activity despite the early hour. Phone calls about permit applications, discussions about material deliveries, the constant background hum of a successful business in full operation. It was exciting and intimidating at the same time. Patricia Williams, the office manager, emerged from behind a desk covered with project folders and blueprints. She was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with an efficiency about her that reminded me of Mrs. Henderson. "Ms. Mitchell, welcome. I've prepared a comprehensive overview of our current projects and pending bids. Would you like to start with the financial overview or the operational details? Maybe start with helping me understand what a typical day looks like here," I said. "I want to get a feel for how everything works before we dive into the numbers." For the next 2 hours, they walked me through the intricate ecosystem Dad had created. Mitchell Construction wasn't just a building company. It was a carefully orchestrated operation that touched every aspect of the local construction industry. "We currently have 12 active residential projects," Patricia explained, pointing to a large wall chart that tracked progress on each job. 8 custom homes ranging from $800,000 to $1.8 million, 3 renovation projects, and 1 luxury estate that's been our most ambitious residential project to date. James Butler, the project manager, joined us for the operational tour. He was exactly what I'd expected from a construction project manager. Practical, detail-oriented, with the kind of quiet confidence that inspired trust in both clients and workers. "The key to our success," he explained as we walked through the warehouse, "is that we control more of the process than most construction companies. We have our own millwork shop, so we can create custom cabinets and trim work in-house. We have relationships with stone quarries and lumber mills that give us priority access to premium materials. And we employ our own electricians and plumbers rather than subcontracting everything." The workshop was impressive. Rows of sophisticated woodworking equipment operated by craftsmen who clearly took pride in their work. I watched one man carefully routing decorative details into what looked like a custom mantelpiece, his attention to quality obvious in every careful movement. "Your father believed that if you're going to charge premium prices, you have to deliver premium quality," Frank said. "We don't cut corners, we don't rush jobs. and we don't make promises we can't keep. That's why we have an 18-month waiting list for custom homes. The commercial division occupied a separate building, where a different team managed the larger, more complex projects that generated the bulk of the company's revenue. Current projects included a new medical office complex, renovations to the city's largest shopping center, and the construction of what would become the region's first LEED-certified office building. Commercial work is different from residential, James explained. The timelines are longer, the regulations are more complex, and the clients are usually committees rather than individual families. But the profit margins are better, and the projects often lead to additional work as clients expand or need maintenance. What impressed me most was how well-run everything appeared to be. This wasn't a company coasting on past success or struggling to maintain quality as it grew. Every process had been thoughtfully designed, every employee seemed to understand their role clearly, and every project was being managed with careful attention to detail and timeline. The infrastructure division is our steady backbone, Patricia said as we reviewed the government contracts. Municipal work doesn't pay as well as private projects, but it's reliable, and it keeps our crews busy during slower periods in the other divisions. Current infrastructure projects included road improvements for the county, renovation of the historic courthouse, and construction of a new fire station that would serve the growing suburban areas south of town. Your father was strategic about bidding on government work, James added. He never took on so much that we'd be dependent on it, but he maintained enough contracts to ensure steady cash flow and give our workers consistent employment. By lunchtime, my head was spinning with information about profit margins, project timelines, employee benefits, equipment maintenance schedules, and dozens of other operational details that I'd never considered. Running a construction company wasn't just about building things. It was about managing complex logistics, maintaining relationships with suppliers and subcontractors, navigating regulatory requirements, and coordinating the work of over 100 employees. I can see why David thought he should inherit this, I said, during our lunch break. This is incredibly complex. I'm not sure I'm qualified to run something this sophisticated. Frank's response was immediate and firm. With respect, Sarah, David couldn't run this operation if his life depended on it. He shows up when he feels like it. He doesn't understand half the technical aspects of what we do. And the crew doesn't respect him because he's never actually learned the business from the ground up. Your father didn't start out knowing how to run a multi-million-dollar company either, Patricia added. He learned by asking questions, paying attention, and surrounding himself with people who knew what they were doing. That's exactly what you're doing right now. The difference, James said quietly, is that your father cared about doing things right. He cared about our reputation, our employees, our clients. David cares about David. The crew knows the difference, and so do our clients. Their confidence in me was both encouraging and terrifying. They seemed to believe I could learn to run this empire Dad had built, but I wasn't sure I shared their optimism. What would happen if I just sold it? I asked. Found a buyer and walked away with the money? The three of them exchanged glances, and Frank answered for the group. That's your decision, of course. It's your inheritance. But 127 families depend on this company for their livelihoods. Most of our employees have been with us for years, some for decades. This isn't just a business. It's a community. Your father built something that matters here. He was right. And I knew it. This wasn't just about money or proving Margaret wrong or even honoring Dad's memory. This was about the responsibility that came with inheriting something that affected so many other people's lives. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath. Then I guess we better figure out how to make this work. The legal papers arrived on Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who found me at the construction office reviewing project budgets with Patricia. The thick envelope contained exactly what I'd expected. A formal challenge to Dad's will, filed by Margaret, David, and Emma, claiming mental incompetence, undue influence, and fraud. They're not wasting any time, Mr. Thompson said when I called him immediately after reading through the complaint. But this is exactly what your father anticipated. Are you available to meet this afternoon? We should review our response strategy. The allegations in the lawsuit were as predictable as they were baseless. According to Margaret's attorney, Dad had been suffering from dementia and depression that impaired his judgment. I had allegedly manipulated him through Mrs. Henderson, who was characterized as my co-conspirator in a scheme to defraud the rightful heirs of their inheritance. The most insulting claim was that I had abandoned the family for years, only returning when I learned about Dad's wealth and somehow convinced him to disinherit his loving wife and devoted children in favor of an estranged daughter who showed no interest in his well-being. "It's all garbage," Mr. Thompson assured me as we sat in his office that afternoon. "But we need to be prepared for this to get ugly. Margaret's attorney is known for aggressive tactics and media manipulation." Media manipulation? Small-town newspapers, local television stations. They'll try to control the narrative, make this about a greedy outsider stealing from a grieving family. It's a strategy that can be effective if we don't counter it properly. If summoned by his words, my phone rang with a call from a reporter at the local newspaper. I let it go to voicemail, but the message was revealing. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling about the will contest filed by your stepmother. She's provided some very interesting background about family dynamics and your relationship with your father. I'd like to get your side of the story." "They're already working the press," I told Mr. Thompson. "Then we need to work it too. But first, let's make sure we have all our documentation in order." The psychological evaluation of Dad's mental competency was devastating to their case. Dr. Patricia Williams, the geriatric psychiatrist, not our office manager, had conducted extensive testing just 2 weeks before Dad updated his will. Her report showed cognitive function well within normal ranges for his age, no signs of dementia or impaired judgment, and clear understanding of his financial situation and family relationships. "Your father specifically requested this evaluation," Mr. Thompson explained. "He told Dr. Williams he wanted to ensure his will couldn't be challenged on competency grounds. He was very methodical about protecting his final wishes. The private investigator's report on Margaret, David, and Emma's financial irregularities was equally damaging to their credibility. How could they claim to be devoted family members when they'd been systematically stealing from Dad for years? The question is whether we want to use this evidence proactively or hold it in reserve," Mr. Thompson said. "If we release it now, it destroys their narrative, but makes us look vindictive. If we wait until they force us to use it in court, it looks more like legitimate defense." I was still considering our options when Mrs. Henderson called with disturbing news. "Sarah, there are people asking questions about you around town. A private investigator hired by Margaret's attorney, I think. He's been to the art store, the hotel where you're staying, even Mrs. Henderson. Even in Dad's final medical appointments, she had been the one showing up for him. Dr. Martinez, would you be willing to testify about this? About the lack of family involvement in his medical care?" "I've already spoken to your attorney. Mr. Thompson contacted me yesterday after I called him about what I'd observed. But there's more, Ms. Mitchell. Something that directly contradicts the claims in the lawsuit." He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "I keep detailed notes on all my patients, partly for medical reasons, but partly because I've learned that family dynamics around serious illness can become complicated." "What kind of notes?" "Your father told me about his family situation during our conversations. He was very articulate about his concerns regarding his wife and stepchildren's financial behavior. He specifically mentioned that he was planning to change his will because he'd discovered evidence of theft and manipulation." This was huge. Independent medical testimony that Dad had been planning will changes months before he actually made them, based on his own observations rather than any outside influence. When was this conversation? January 15th, almost 2 months before he actually changed the will. He was mentally sharp, emotionally stable, and clearly concerned about protecting his assets from what he called people who had proven they couldn't be trusted with money. Dr. Martinez's notes were meticulous. Date, time, Dad's exact words, even observations about his mental state and cognitive function. It was medical documentation that would be nearly impossible for Margaret's attorneys to discredit. "There's one more thing," Dr. Martinez said. "Your father asked me directly whether stress and family conflict could affect his heart condition. I told him that emotional stress could certainly worsen his symptoms, and he said something I'll never forget. Then I need to fix this situation before it kills me." The irony was devastating. Dad had been trying to address the family dysfunction that was literally breaking his heart, but he'd run out of time before he could complete the emotional healing he'd hoped for. He mentioned you several times, Ms. Mitchell, always with pride and regret. He said you were the only family member who had built a successful life without relying on his money, and that he wished he'd been brave enough to maintain a relationship with you despite the family pressure. I was fighting back tears again. Did he ever mention wanting to reconcile? Multiple times. He said his biggest regret was allowing his marriage to cost him his relationship with his daughter. He talked about wanting to call you but being afraid you'd reject him after so many years of distance. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to counter Margaret's narrative. Independent, professional testimony that Dad had been planning these changes for months, that he was mentally competent, and that his decisions were based on careful observation rather than manipulation. But the most damaging revelation came when Mr. Thompson called me that evening with news from the private investigator Dad had hired. Marcus Webb found something interesting when he went back through Margaret's financial records. Remember how she claimed in the newspaper that she was struggling financially and had sacrificed to care for your father? Yes, it was part of the whole devoted wife narrative. Well, it turns out Margaret has been receiving substantial monthly payments from a life insurance policy on your father for the past 18 months. I felt the ground shift beneath me. What do you mean? She took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on your father in October 2022, listing herself as the beneficiary. The premiums were paid from the family accounts, but she didn't tell him about it. She's been planning for his death and counting on that payout since before he was even diagnosed with heart disease. The implications were staggering. Margaret hadn't just been stealing money and ignoring Dad's health. She'd been betting on his death while presenting herself as his devoted caregiver. How is that even legal? Spouses can take out life insurance policies on each other, and as long as the premiums are paid, the insurance company doesn't investigate the circumstances unless there's obvious fraud. But taking out a policy and concealing it from the insured person while simultaneously neglecting their health care, that's going to look very bad in court. Does she know we've discovered this? Not yet. Marcus only found it because he was doing a comprehensive review of all financial accounts and noticed the premium payments. Margaret probably thought this would never be discovered since the policy wasn't in your father's name. The evidence was mounting into an overwhelming case against Margaret's credibility. Far from being the devoted wife who had been cheated out of her rightful inheritance, she emerged as someone who had been systematically exploiting Dad financially, while actually counting on his death for additional profit. There's one more thing, Mr. Thompson said. The insurance company requires a medical exam for policies of this size. Margaret convinced your father to take the exam by telling him it was for a group health insurance plan through her real estate company. The medical records from that exam show he was already showing signs of heart disease that should have prompted immediate treatment. But she didn't tell him? According to Dr. Martinez's records, your father wasn't diagnosed with heart disease until 8 months later, when he came to the emergency room with chest pains. If Margaret had shared the insurance medical results with him, he could have started treatment much earlier and possibly lived longer. The pattern was clear now. Margaret hadn't just neglected Dad's health, she had actively concealed information that could have saved his life while positioning herself to profit from his death. Mr. Thompson, I want to release all of this information. The medical testimony, the insurance fraud, the private investigator's findings, everything. I want the public to see exactly what kind of devoted family they were supporting. Are you sure? Once this information is public, there's no going back. It will destroy any possibility of private settlement. Good. Dad trusted me with the truth, and I think the community deserves to know it too. The next morning's newspaper would tell a very different story about the Mitchell family will contest, and Margaret's carefully constructed narrative would finally crumble under the weight of documented evidence. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the will contest hearing. Word had spread throughout the community about the explosive revelations that had emerged over the past week, and it seemed like half the town had shown up to witness the final confrontation. Margaret, David, and Emma sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a silver-haired man named Reynolds, who specialized in will contests and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. But even he looked uncomfortable as boxes of evidence were wheeled into the courtroom by our legal team. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had presided over family court for nearly 20 years, called the hearing to order with a stern warning about courtroom decorum. She'd clearly seen the media coverage and wanted to ensure this didn't turn into a circus. This is a hearing to determine the validity of Robert Mitchell's will, dated March 15, 2024, she announced. The petitioners claim the will is invalid due to mental incompetence and undue influence. The respondent maintains that the will is valid and represents Robert Mitchell's true wishes. Mr. Reynolds, present your case. Margaret's attorney opened with the same arguments they'd been making in the media. Dad had been depressed and confused in his final months, influenced by his guilt over his estranged relationship with me, and manipulated by Mrs. Henderson acting as my agent. The will represented a dramatic departure from his previous estate, planning, and was inconsistent with 15 years of family relationships. Robert Mitchell was a devoted family man who loved his wife and stepchildren, Reynolds argued. The idea that he would suddenly disinherit the people who had cared for him daily in favor of a daughter who had abandoned the family is simply not credible. He called character witnesses who testified about Margaret's devotion as a wife, David's involvement in the family business, and Emma's efforts to overcome her personal struggles. It was all very touching and completely irrelevant to the legal questions at hand. But when Reynolds tried to present evidence of Dad's alleged mental decline, everything fell apart. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson said during cross-examination of Margaret, would you please explain to the court why you took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on your husband in October 2022? Margaret's face went white. That was just prudent financial planning. Spouses take out insurance policies all the time. And did you inform your husband about this policy? We discussed various insurance matters. That's not what I asked. Mrs. Mitchell, did you specifically tell your husband that you had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on his life? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Margaret finally admitted, no, I didn't tell him specifically about that policy. And when the insurance company required a medical exam, you told your husband it was for a group health plan, didn't you? I may have simplified the explanation. Mrs. Mitchell, that medical exam revealed signs of heart disease that should have prompted immediate treatment. Did you share those results with your husband? I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't have known how to interpret medical results. But you didn't give him the results to share with his doctor, did you? Margaret's attorney objected. But the damage was done. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers as people began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Mr. Thompson systematically dismantled every aspect of their case. Dr. Williams's psychological evaluation proved Dad's mental competency beyond question. Dr. Martinez's testimony established that Dad had been planning will changes months before any alleged manipulation could have occurred. Mrs. Henderson's testimony revealed that she had been documenting family financial irregularities at Dad's request, not conspiring with me to influence him. But the most devastating moment came when Mr. Thompson read Dad's final letter aloud in court. The detailed accusations about Margaret's gambling, David's theft, and Emma's prescription drug fraud, all supported by the private investigators' documented evidence, painted a picture of a family that had been systematically betraying the man they claimed to love. Robert Mitchell wasn't confused or depressed, Mr. Thompson argued. He was heartbroken that the people he had trusted and supported had been stealing from him while he was dying. Heartbroken that his attempts to reconcile with his daughter had been sabotaged by a stepfamily that saw her as a threat to their inheritance expectations. David's theft of company equipment was documented with photographs and employee testimony. Margaret's gambling losses were proven with casino records and bank statements. Emma's forged checks were verified through handwriting analysis and surveillance footage from the bank. These are not the actions of people who loved and cared for Robert Mitchell, Mr. Thompson concluded. These are the actions of people who saw him as a source of money and were already planning how to divide his assets before he was even dead. When Judge Hawkins called for a recess before her ruling, Margaret finally broke. She stood up in the middle of the courtroom and screamed at me across the room. You destroyed this family. You turned him against us. Everything was fine until you poisoned his mind with your lies. Mrs. Mitchell, Control yourself, Judge Hawkins warned. But Margaret was beyond control now. She never cared about him. She abandoned him for years, and then she came crawling back when she smelled money. I was excluded from his funeral, I said quietly, but my voice carried in the silent courtroom. I learned about the inheritance at the same time you did. That's a lie. You planned this whole thing. David tried to calm his mother, but she shook him off. 15 years I devoted to that man. 15 years I gave up my own life to make him happy. And for what? So some ungrateful brat could waltz in and steal everything? You gave up your life? I stood up then, unable to stay silent any longer. You spent his money on gambling trips while he was dying alone. You hid medical information that could have saved his life. You stole from his business and taught your children to do the same. What exactly did you give up, Margaret? Order. Judge Hawkins banged her gavel, but the confrontation continued. I gave up everything for him, Margaret shouted. My career, my independence, my future, and you gave up nothing. You didn't even bother to visit. I didn't visit because you made it clear I wasn't welcome. You banned me from family events, dismissed my achievements, and convinced Dad that I didn't care about him. Because you didn't care. You proved that by staying away. I stayed away because being around you was toxic. The words came out with 15 years of pent-up frustration behind them. Every family gathering was a reminder that I didn't belong, that I would never be good enough, that my own father valued your children more than me. Emma was crying openly now, and even David looked shaken by the raw emotion filling the courtroom. But he did love me, I continued, my voice breaking. And in the end, he saw through all your manipulation and recognized what you really were. That's why you lost, Margaret. Not because I poisoned his mind, but because he finally opened his eyes. Judge Hawkins restored order and recessed for 2 hours while she reviewed the evidence. When court reconvened, her ruling was swift and decisive. The court finds that Robert Mitchell's will dated March 15, 2024, is valid and represents his true wishes. The evidence clearly establishes his mental competency at the time the will was executed, and there is no credible evidence of undue influence or fraud. The petitioner's challenge is denied. She paused and looked directly at Margaret, David, and Emma. Furthermore, the court is troubled by the evidence of financial misconduct presented during this hearing. The district attorney's office will be receiving copies of all relevant documentation for their review. It was over. Dad's final wishes would be honored, and the truth about Margaret's family had been exposed for everyone to see. As people filed out of the courtroom, many of them stopped to offer me words of support and condolence. Your father would be proud, Mrs. Henderson said, squeezing my hand. You fought for him the way he should have fought for you all those years ago. Margaret, David, and Emma left without saying another word, their legal challenge defeated and their reputations in ruins. But I felt no satisfaction in their humiliation, only sadness for the family that might have been if love had been stronger than greed, if honesty had been valued more than money. Dad's justice had been served, but the real victory was still ahead, proving that I could honor his legacy by building something positive from the ashes of our broken family. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind my childhood home, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The roses my mother had planted 25 years ago were blooming again, carefully restored from the overgrown tangle I'd found when I reclaimed the house. The front door was red again, just like she'd loved it, and the kitchen windowsill held her collection of vintage mixing bowls that I'd rescued from storage. It had taken 3 months to undo Margaret's sterile renovations and restore the warmth my mother had created. Every room told a story now. Photos of my parents' courtship on the mantel, my mother's quilt displayed on the back of the sofa, Dad's favorite reading chair positioned by the window where he used to review blueprints on Sunday mornings. The why. Transformation wasn't just about the house. In 6 months, I'd gone from being a freelance journalist with a comfortable but modest income to the owner of a multi-million-dollar construction empire. More importantly, I'd discovered that I actually enjoyed the challenge of running a business, especially one that created homes and buildings that would serve the community for decades. Frank Morrison had become my unofficial mentor, teaching me the practical aspects of construction, while Patricia Williams handled the administrative complexities that kept everything running smoothly. James Butler had taken on expanded responsibilities for client relations, freeing me to focus on strategic planning and the financial management that would ensure the company's continued growth. "You're getting good at this," Frank had told me. The previous week, as we reviewed plans for a new residential development. "Your dad would be amazed at how quickly you've picked up the business side of things." The company was thriving under my leadership. Perhaps because I brought a fresh perspective, unclouded by "that's how we've always done it" thinking. We'd landed 3 major new contracts in the past month, including the design and construction of a new elementary school that would serve the growing suburban areas east of town. But the most meaningful project was the one I'd initiated personally, the Carol Mitchell Memorial Community Center, built on a piece of land Dad had owned but never developed. It would house a food pantry, job training programs, and support services for families dealing with addiction and mental health issues. The center was funded entirely by my inheritance, and it would serve as a living tribute to both my parents' values. Emma had quietly entered a residential treatment program in another state, using her $25,000 inheritance exactly as Dad had hoped. She'd sent me a letter 2 months ago, apologizing for her behavior during the will contest and thanking me for not pressing criminal charges despite having enough evidence to send her to prison. "I understand now that Dad was trying to help me, not punish me," she'd written. "The inheritance he left me was exactly what I needed to start over, and I'm finally ready to do the work to get clean and stay clean." David had left town entirely, moving to Atlanta, where he'd found work with a construction company that didn't know about his history of theft and gambling. Margaret had been forced to sell her house to pay legal fees and had moved to a small apartment across town where she lived alone with her bitterness and her ruined reputation. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but I didn't feel guilty about it either. They had made their choices, and Dad had simply ensured that there were consequences for those choices. Mrs. Henderson had officially come out of retirement to serve as my executive assistant, a role that gave her authority to coordinate between the various divisions while keeping me informed about everything that required my attention. She'd also become something like a surrogate grandmother, offering wisdom and support as I navigated the complexities of business ownership and small-town politics. "Your parents would be so proud of what you've accomplished," she said, joining me in the garden with 2 cups of coffee. "Not just the business success, but the way you've used your inheritance to give back to the community." The memorial garden we'd created in the backyard was peaceful in the early morning light. 2 simple granite benches sat among the roses and lavender, with bronze plaques honoring Robert and Carol Mitchell. This was where I came to think, to plan, to remember the love that had shaped me even when it felt absent. "Do you think I made the right choice staying here?" I asked. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have sold everything and gone back to Chicago. What does your heart tell you?" I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said, my heart was in journalism, in the excitement of investigative reporting and the satisfaction of exposing corruption and injustice. But I discovered that running a business that employed 127 people and served hundreds of families was its own form of public service. "I think I'm where I'm supposed to be," I said finally. "Dad built something meaningful here, and I want to continue that legacy while making it my own." That's all any parent can hope for, that their children will take what they've built and make it better. The previous week, I'd been elected to the Chamber of Commerce, the first step toward becoming more involved in community leadership. I'd also been approached about running for city council, though I wasn't ready for that level of political involvement just yet. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Mrs. Henderson said, settling onto my mother's bench. "Your father left one final instruction that I was supposed to wait 6 months to share." She handed me an envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. But this one was different from the letters I'd found in his secret compartment. This one was addressed to Sarah Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Construction. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've survived the legal challenge and proven yourself capable of running the business I built. I knew you would succeed because you have. Your mother's heart and my stubborn determination to do what's right. The company is yours now, not just legally but truly. Build something even better than what I left you. Make mistakes, learn from them, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong in your own family's legacy. I love you. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took death to finally say so clearly. Love always, Dad. Tears streamed down my face as I read his final words, but they were tears of healing rather than grief. For the first time in 15 years, I felt truly connected to my father, understanding not just his love for me, but his faith in my ability to carry forward what he'd started. He wrote that the day after he changed his will, Mrs. Henderson said softly. He was so excited about the possibility that you might actually come home and take over the business. He said it would be like getting his daughter back and ensuring his legacy at the same time. As the sun rose higher, painting the garden in warm, golden light, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The excluded daughter who'd been banned from her father's funeral had become the successful businesswoman who was now one of the community's most prominent citizens. The inheritance I'd never expected had become the foundation for a life I'd never imagined, but was exactly what I needed. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. New client wants to meet this afternoon. About a $3 commercial project. Are you available? I smiled as I typed back, absolutely. Schedule it for 2 p.m. This was my life now. Board meetings and construction schedules, community involvement and business development, the daily satisfaction of building something meaningful, while honoring the memory of parents who had loved me in their own imperfect ways. Standing in my mother's garden beside the memorial to both my parents, I finally understood what Dad had been trying to give me. Not just money or property or business ownership, but something much more valuable. The chance to come home on my own terms, to claim my place in the family legacy, and to build a future that honored the past while creating something entirely new. The scared, excluded teenager was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, understood her strength, and was ready to write the next chapter of the Mitchell family story, one of healing, growth, and the kind of success that comes from using your gifts to serve something larger than yourself. As I walked back toward the house to get ready for another day of running the empire my father had built and my mother had inspired, I whispered a promise to both of them. I'll make you proud, both of you. I'll build something beautiful. And for the first time in my adult life, I knew exactly where I belonged.